Currently, the U.S. has 50 states. The most recent state to join was Hawaii, officially becoming the 50th state of the U.S. in August 1959. Previously, in January 1959, Alaska became the 49th state. Thus, these two states joined within just 1 year, marking the last territorial expansion of the U.S. to date. But are those the last states? Many Canadians want them to become the 51st state of the United States, Donald Trump has said. And he has also emphasized that Canadians will benefit from this scenario, as well as security. With promises, if Canada merges with the United States, there will be no more tariffs, and taxes will also be reduced. And together, they will build a great nation. What if Canada became the 51st state of the United States, as Donald Trump has said? First, let's look at a very visual story, which is geography. In terms of area, what would the two countries be like when they merged? Currently, the area of the United States is about 9.8 million square kilometers, including 50 states, of which Alaska is the largest state with an area of about 1.7 million square kilometers. The United States is the third largest country in the world. Canada has an area of about 9.98 million square kilometers, second in the world after Russia. The total area after the merger will be 19.78 million square kilometers and will become the largest country in the world. Because Russia has an area of only more than 17 million square kilometers, of course, only here is compared to the United US and Canada. The United US and Canada will account for more than 13% of the total land area of the world. And that would be nearly twice the size of Europe, which is just over 10 million square kilometers today, and larger than the entirety of South America. With Mexico to the south and no land neighbors to the north, the United States and Canada would then be the only nation to control 3 of the 4 borders in North America and the famous US-Canada border, known as the Cut Line. This treeless area, 6 meters wide, would run through everything that currently lies between the US and Canada, from tiny remote islands to mountainous regions. That border would no longer exist. Canada currently owns a large portion of the Arctic Ocean, including important areas such as the Arctic Archipelago. Together, the United States and Canada would control shipping lanes through the Arctic, which are expanding due to melting ice. This route would shorten the shipping distance between Europe and Asia by 40% compared to the Suez Canal route, making the Arctic Ocean a lifeline for global trade. Of course, the ice would melt or the icebreakers would run at full capacity and be extremely efficient. The US would compete directly with Russia, which currently controls much of the Arctic, in commercial and military projects in this region. The Arctic holds 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and about 30% of its natural gas. By including Canada, the US would have access to a large portion of these resources, or a very large country. If Canada were to become America's 51st ice cap, then more land would mean more resources, because Canada is currently one of the most resource-rich countries in the world. When combined with the United States, the amount of resources controlled by the United States increases dramatically. Canada itself owns the third largest amount of oil in the world, about 170 billion barrels, after countries like Venezuela and India. Combined, the US and Canada would control 20% of the world's total oil, far more than any other country. Canada is also one of the world's leading gas producers, with huge amounts. The US is also the same, and combining its gas resources would once again solidify its position as a global superpower. Canada is the 4th largest producer of hydroelectric power in the world, thanks to its vast network of rivers, lakes, and dams, such as the James Bay Dam. Combined with the United States, its total hydroelectric output would rival even China. Canada is also the world's leading producer of uranium. Uranium is key to nuclear power and strategic weapons. Together, it would make the United States a nation completely self-sufficient in nuclear fuel. Canada also has large amounts of precious metals such as nickel, copper, zinc, and silver, especially rare earths. Rare earths in Canada will add to the demand for high-tech development when combined. So in the big picture, if Canada becomes the 51st state, the US will not only be the largest in terms of area, but also so rich in resources that it controls almost every strategic sector in the world. Oil and gas will account for about 20% of the world's total energy. Uranium will be the world's #1 supplier. Agricultural products will dominate global markets, and fresh water will be abundant and in huge quantities. This merger would make the U.S. one of the largest resource machines on the planet and would be difficult for any competitor to match. And a U.S. superpower position would probably be untouchable in the future. That is geographically when merged. What about population? If Canada becomes the 51st state of the United States, the population of the new United States will follow suit significantly. Currently, the population of the United States is over 330 million people, ranking third in the world after India at #1 and China at #2. Canada's population is about 40 million people, and the combined population will be over 370 million people. So the third place of the United States and Canada will not change. But the gap of the top two countries is still too large, not even close to the fraction of the top two countries. Currently, the majority of Canada's population is concentrated along the southern border, especially in large cities such as Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. Meanwhile, the majority of Canada's territory is estimated to be about 80% of the far north, where there are either overpopulation or no people living. Traveling between major cities is not too inconvenient because, as mentioned now, the Canadian population is also living very close to the U.S. border. After the Union, the U.S. is still the main population center with the most populous states such as California, Texas, and Florida. Canada only adds a modest amount of population, equivalent to the population of California, but does not significantly change the distribution of the population. Culturally, Canada is also a diverse culture with 2 official languages, French and English, and many ethnic minorities. In particular, the French people from Quebec and the indigenous communities will add new groups to the United States. When the United States unites, it will have to manage this cultural difference, especially in regions that demand high autonomy, such as Quebec. One thing that people are very interested in is what the economy will be like after the merger. If the US and Canada merged, the economies of both countries would have big changes. And now it is just one country. It would create an undisputed economic superpower, and the new GDP would be increased. Canada currently has a GDP of about $2.3 trillion. Canada's $2.3 trillion figure now ranks in the top 10 globally. According to the International Monetary Fund, it is slightly ahead of Brazil, ahead of Russia, and ahead of South Korea. And what about the United States? The United States is a global economic superpower. The U.S. GDP is around $30 trillion, and the new total GDP will be around $32.3 trillion. This would once again cement America's position as the world's largest economy, far surpassing China's $19.5 trillion. But the healthcare system would be a major point of contention after the merger. Canada has a free public healthcare system, while the U.S. relies heavily on private health insurance. This merger, deciding whether to keep the public health system or convert to a private model, will be a complicated issue. If the U.S. imposes its model, the healthcare costs of people from a state that we can temporarily call Canada could increase significantly, affecting their lives. On the political side, if the U.S. and Canada merge, Canada becomes the 51st state, the politics of the two countries will change profoundly, especially for Canada. First, Canada would lose its sovereignty and abandon its current constitutional monarchy, in which the British monarch is the head of state. Relations between the United States and Britain would also be affected, as the role of the British monarchy in Canada would be eliminated. Instead, Canada would operate on the model of a United States federal republic. Congress would be dissolved and Canadian provinces would be organized into American states. There would no longer be a Canadian nation on the world stage. Currently, it is a member of the United Nations, the G7, the G20, and the Commonwealth of Nations. However, after becoming a state of the United States, Canada will no longer have an independent role in these organizations. The United States will be the sole representative of the new federation, which means that Canada will no longer have a separate voice in international affairs. If the US and Canada merge, who will be most worried? Of course, it will be Russia and China. If Canada becomes the 51st state of the US, Russia will be one of the countries most affected. For one thing, this merger will completely change the game in the Arctic, an area where Russia has a large coastline and is dominant. Canada, which controls a large part of the Arctic with its vast territories, would add to the U.S. position. All control would be in Washington's hands, making the Arctic a place where the U.S. has an advantage over Russia. Russia, which has spent billions building military bases and developing Arctic shipping lanes, would face greater military pressure from the U.S., which can easily deploy forces right next to Russia's borders. What about China? China will not escape the effects of this consolidation. One of the biggest problems for China is losing a large and important trading partner like Canada. Currently, Canada is one of the significant suppliers of oil, gas, and rare earth metals to China. If the U.S. controls all the resources of the new state of Canada, China will have to rely more on other sources of supply that the U.S. has restricted through trade policy. This is especially serious when China needs a lot of rare earths and raw materials to develop high-tech industries. Imagine a China that wants to produce electric cars or electronics, but has to be subject to raw material control from the new economic superpower that is the U.S. when there is an additional state, which of course the U.S. does not like China and always wants to find ways to impoverish China. The merger would also strengthen China's geopolitical influence in North America. Many Chinese goods enter North America through Canada, especially major ports like Vancouver. With the United States directly controlling these ports, China would face harsh trade barriers from its arch-rival. If the U.S. decides to impose new tariffs or trade restrictions, China will lose a strategic trade route, one that is a bit circuitous but still beneficial to the country. In the long run, a U.S.-Canada merger would completely change the global balance of power. Russia, which prides itself on its position in the Arctic, would be put on the defensive not only militarily, but also in terms of energy. The U.S., with its vast oil and gas resources from a new state, would be able to provide alternative energy to Europe, reducing Russia's influence. China would face an even stronger economic rival. In short, the merger of the U.S. and Canada would make Russia and China the most annoying and unpopular rivals who would not want to see this scenario. Russia loses a lot of its power. China also has a new and stronger rival. This will be a big blow to the position of two countries that want to catch up with the U.S., forcing them to find ways to adapt to a new world. What do you think about this scenario? Thank you for following this story. If you find it interesting, you can press the subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and share. And now I would like to say goodbye. Goodbye and see you again.